This is Law for Community Workers on the Go, a podcast for community and health workers.
So, to me, Fine Fixer is, I suppose, a collection of information on fines from different resources. So, of course, Revenue New South Wales was our main resource. But we know when you go onto websites to look for information that often there'll be different pathways that'll lead you and you get confused and you don't know where you should go. So what we've tried to do was narrow down the main aspects of when you've got a type of fine, what you should do. So, for example, a traffic fine, if you weren't driving, how you should nominate a driver, and more information on consequences if you don't nominate a driver or if you incorrectly nominate a driver. Same with the ability to maybe if you want to court elect a matter. So, yeah, to me it's just putting a lot of information into one place and providing direct links to where people can go to make that next step of dealing with their fine. So, yeah, just a portal that's full of easy to read and links to access to be able to deal and hopefully resolve a fine issue.
My name is Josh and I'm a solicitor in the Community Legal Education branch at Legal Aid New South Wales. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land where I'm recording this podcast from. I would also like to pay respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Today we're talking about fines and Fine Fixer New South Wales, which is a new online tool that helps you find out what your options are when you get a fine. Fines are the most common legal issue that civil lawyers at Legal Aid New South Wales advise on, but this is a tool that may reduce those numbers. This tool can help higher capacity clients so that they may not need to speak to a lawyer, or it could also help community workers like you who are working with clients who may not have the digital literacy or may face other barriers when trying to use this tool, so that your client may not need to speak to a lawyer. We do, of course, accept that there will be some situations where, of course, the best thing for a client is to speak to a lawyer about their fines and other legal issues. In this episode, we introduce you all, our community worker audience, to this great tool, which can be used in both Victoria and New South Wales. We'll hear a bit more about the history of this tool during the episode. So how does it work? In broad terms, it works like this. If you get a fine, or someone you're working with gets a fine, just Google Fine Fixer New South Wales and go to the website, which, as it happens, has a really good simple design that looks good on any device that you're using. Once you're on the website, you're asked a series of questions so that the tool can figure out what's going on, and then it spits out what your options are to deal with that fine. Magic. Or maybe programming. I always confuse those two. Okay. 3 thoughts before we start speaking with our guests. I'm hoping that by the end of this episode, people will be aware that before paying a fine, it's good to think about whether it was correctly issued first and looking at whether you can challenge it. Of course, we will talk about work and development orders, which are great. Stay tuned for more about that. But as a first step, generally we should be looking at whether the fine was correctly issued. If a client you're working with has multiple fines, it can be an indicator that something bigger is going on for them in their life. And it could be a good time to do a legal health check to see if there are any other legal issues that they may need help with. We'll put in the show notes some information about legal health checks. And thirdly, we hope that this tool can become part of what you and your clients, where appropriate, think of when you get a fine. This tool can be a great first step to see what your options are and help avoid the situation where people don't take any action or aren't sure what to do when they get a fine. And obviously that problem can get bigger over time if you don't take any action. Today we speak with 3 experts: Brendan Lacota, former Principal Solicitor of Moonee Valley Legal Service, who were one of the key organisations behind creating Fine Fixer in Victoria and who is now working as a consultant; Kirsty Harrison, a Senior Solicitor in Legal Aid New South Wales Work and Development Order Service; and Nicole Stack, a paralegal in the same team who was key in adapting Fine Fixer to New South Wales from Victoria. By the end of this episode, you should have a clear understanding of why this tool matters and the benefits that it offers. We will start off by hearing from Brendan, then we'll hear from Nicole, and finally we'll finish off with Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Brendan Lacota. I'm a consultant that works on a number of projects in the legal assistance sector, including technology and evaluation. With FindFixer, I was involved as a project manager in my role as principal of the Moonee Valley Legal Service.
Wonderful. And can you explain to us what is FindFixer?
FindFixer is an online tool that helps people to understand their infringements, work out what they can do about them, and take action.
How did it come about? Where did this all begin?
So FindFixer was an idea that came out of a program called the RMIT Fast Track program. So a group of students were presented with a challenge. FindFixer started in Victoria, where at the time, so this was in 2015, at the time the infringement system was incredibly confusing. People couldn't understand where they were coming from. If they had lots of fines, it became very difficult to understand what their options might be. So we presented this knotty problem to a group of students at RMIT who went through a 13-week design thinking program where they were guided through design thinking methodologies to try and figure out, well, is there a way that we can try and solve this problem and make fines easier to understand for people? So they went through this process, and what they hit on was the idea that there was this entire cohort of help seekers who had received fines in Victoria who weren't eligible for legal aid, they weren't eligible for assistance from a community legal centre, but they still didn't know what to do with their fines. But they were able to use online tools to try and understand their fines better, and with a bit of information were really quite capable of self-helping, whether that be putting in applications for internal review or trying for special circumstances, which is for people who have more significant circumstances going on in their life that might excuse them from having to pay the fine and the penalty, all the way through to trying to identify people who really shouldn't be using an online tool and needed to get help from whether it be legal aid or from a community legal centre.
And do we know a lot about who the users ended up being? So when the RMIT students identify this particular cohort of kind of high capacity people who might be able to resolve their own problems using an online tool, who did those people end up being? Do we know a lot about them?
Yeah, so we completed an evaluation towards the conclusion of the funded part of the project, and we identified that the key user cohort was middle-aged people with a slightly higher number of women than men using the tool, but there was also a significant cohort of users in the over 60s bracket of people who had found their way to FindFixer actually from Facebook, if you'd believe it. It was where they were coming in from, and they were coming through because they were asking questions about the couple of fines that they did have. One of the things that FindFixer, I think, does very well is a couple of really deceptively simple questions right at the start of the tool that are used as heuristics to try and identify whether or not the help seeker is somebody who really should be using an online tool or not. And these questions are just asked about the number of fines the person has. If a person has one fine, then they go through with no problem at all, and they can ask a series of other questions and be given tailored information to their circumstances. But if the person identifies that they have multiple fines, they're presented with an opportunity to either get immediately directed to legal help or try and prioritise their fines based on the one that's most urgent. And if they're unable to do that, then that's taken as a heuristic that they probably need legal help and should go to a community legal centre or legal aid to get some further assistance, even if it is just some one-off advice. And then the final question is if they don't know how many fines they have. And that's taken as a big red flag that says this person really does need help because they don't even know how many fines they've got. They probably shouldn't be using an online tool and need some more intensive help and are directly sent off to, again, legal aid or a community legal centre. So by using those really deceptively simple questions right at the start of the tool, we try and identify people who can self-identify as having the capacity to get some online legal help, and send those who it identifies as being unlikely to be able to use the tool or get adequate assistance from the tool, sends them off to the appropriate service. Because one of the guiding principles that we had during building the tool was making sure that we didn't want people getting bad information. We didn't want somebody who, for example, might have really extreme, exceptional or special circumstances going through the tool and then finding themselves in court at the end of the process. That was the last thing that we wanted to happen, so we wanted to make sure that we did all that we could to identify those people early and send them to the right help. But in the same token, we didn't want to take away people's agency and people's ability to solve their own legal problems if they were able to get the information that they needed. So we wanted to make that information accessible and tailored, because what was out there at the time was often difficult to work out what applied to your circumstances.
Oh, how excellent. And what made you choose fines as the legal issue that you wanted to create this tool for?
Well, at the time, infringements were taking up a disproportionate amount of resources at Legal Aid and community legal centres around the state. Often they were small matters where a little bit of information for the individual about whether or not they had a likely chance of success, or even just providing them with a template letter for an internal review, was enough to get that person on their way. So we needed to make sure that we had a tool that could suit the needs of that sort of help seeker. But we also knew that there are a lot of people out there who didn't even identify a fine as a legal problem, but they were Googling it. They were trying to figure out what they should do online, and there wasn't a lot of information online at the time that was specific or that was easy to understand. So there were lots of individual fact sheets and things, but the person had to wade through lots and lots of text and information to figure out what applied to them and what didn't. So by presenting this information in a new way, in a question and answer, and using some simple if-then artificial intelligence, so some guided decision pathways, so some quite simple AI, we were able to make sure that the information they were presented with was much more narrowly confined to their circumstances and easier to digest.
And do we know much about what impact fines have on an individual, or multiple fines can have on somebody? Is it the kind of legal issue that can...
Yeah, so we know that people who have lots of fines, well, it's often an indicator of underlying legal problems, and that goes back to that heuristic question I was talking about at the start of saying if somebody has multiple fines, especially if they don't even know how many fines they have, that's an indicator that there's something else going on and they probably need to be linked in with legal services more generally. So that's another reason why that heuristic question is asked in the way that it is. So we know that fines are associated with other indicators of disadvantage. Often they're a comorbidity with other legal problems and often health problems. Usually they might be, and there's lots of different situations that might arise in, but it could arise in the context of having other criminal matters. It could arise in the context of family violence or ongoing family law or child protection proceedings. A large number of fines, especially ones that have progressed to an enforcement stage or past just the infringement notice stage, are really an indicator of complexity in a person's life and an inability at that point in time to prioritise those fines because of other things that are going on in their life. So they can actually be used as an indicator of someone who needs to get help, and may actually be an impetus for someone to do so.
You also mentioned that you had the project evaluated. What did you learn from that evaluation?
Yeah, that evaluation was really interesting because at that time in 2018, Fine Fixer was one of the first guided pathways for a legal problem in Victoria. there wasn't a lot of information out there about how people would use it, and there were a lot of assumptions as well. One of the big ones, of course, and people often still try and rely on this, is that older people aren't going to use online tools. It's a common assumption, and one that just isn't true. And that was one of the things that we found in the Find Fixer evaluation, is that A, older people certainly are going to use the tool, but we need to make sure that we're going to places where they're going to find it. They may not Google it in the same way that someone in their early 20s or early 30s might do. The other thing that we found, and that's related to how people find the pathway into the tool, is that marketing is essential. Building an online tool and just having it sit there is essentially useless. You need to invest quite heavily in making sure that you've got a strong Google ad campaign, that you're linked in with social media and social media marketing, to make sure that the product that you've produced or the tool that you've produced actually gets in front of people. Google AdWords in particular are a really powerful tool for not-for-profits, because a lot of not-for-profits are eligible for a Google ad grant, which means that they can have quite a sizable, I think it's $10,000 a month of Google ad dollars available to them free of charge if they're eligible for this grant. And it's a really powerful tool because it gives you the ability to get just-in-time information in front of somebody. So if you're, for example, handing out fact sheets at a community centre or something like that, you may hand your fact sheet to somebody who is thinking about the problem that you've got the fact sheet about at that point in time and are really looking for assistance with it. But chances are they're probably not, and you're really taking quite a scattergun approach to it. The power of Google Ads and Google Search in particular is that you get in front of the eyeballs of somebody who is looking for that information right then because they're actively seeking it out. So if you can make sure that your tool appears high in search results, in particular high in organic search results if you can, but Google Ads if you can't quite get there with the organic results, that can be an incredibly powerful tool for community legal education, because it means that not only is the tool there and you've built the tool for that person, but that person is actually actively seeking information about it at that point in time, so they're much more likely to take action than someone who's, for example, just handed a fact sheet at a community centre. So that marketing point, I think, was probably the most interesting finding of the evaluation, one that has been of most interest to me in how we develop tools and how we think about digital products for help seekers over the 5 or 6 years since we launched Find Fixer. Because it's something that's often overlooked is thinking, well, if I just build this tool, people will use it. And I think what we've learned over the years is that just isn't true.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And do we also know much about whether users, like whether there was a big percentage of users that were actually able to resolve their fines issues?
Yeah, so this is one of the problems, I guess, with an online tool, especially one where, like Find Fixer, we actively made the decision not to collect information about the help seeker, is it makes it very hard for you to follow up and do an evaluation of, well, what happens after the person uses the information in the tool. So we had some simple evaluation tools at the bottom of each page saying, was this useful? Did this information help? That sort of thing. And people said that they found it quite useful. Interestingly, every page on the site had quite a high positive score of, was this helpful? Yes, except for one, and that was the one where it told people that they just had to pay their fine.
People not liking that bad news.
People did not like that advice.
Yeah.
But that said, the only way that they ever got to that page was if they said that they'd received the fine, they didn't have any special circumstances, and they didn't have any reason why they shouldn't have to pay the fine. So that one I always found quite interesting and somehow led to negative scores, but there you go. How to follow up people for online tools, though, is such an interesting question. because we have to make this decision early on when you're designing an online tool about whether or not you want to collect information about the help seeker up front or towards the end of the tool. Are you going to collect an email address or a way to contact them later for a follow-up evaluation? In building FindFixer, we made the decision not to collect this information. I think it's certainly open to other people building different sorts of tools to collect that information and see if the person is willing to complete evaluations after the fact. And I think that's really an interesting open space for people to grow into as there are more and more tools like this available to help seekers around Australia.
And what made you decide not to collect that data?
As I said at the start, this was designed using a human-centered design process, and one of the things that was called out very early on in the process in some of our prototyping was people didn't like it when we asked for names and email addresses early on, and when we showed prototypes that didn't have that in it, people who hadn't seen earlier versions with this request for information positively said, oh, you mean I can use this whole thing? I don't have to give you my name or my email address or anything. That's great. That's fantastic. So in our user testing, people just loved that it didn't have that information being collected, and it found it to be much more attractive to them to use, and positively said, well, I'm much more likely to use this because I know you're not collecting data about me. I know you're not going to use this against me in some way. So it became much more trustworthy to them because you weren't asking for information about them. So on balance, with whether or not we could have done an effective evaluation, I think we made the right decision based on the user testing.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, Brendan Lacota. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights into FindFixer. We're very excited to have the tool in New South Wales now. And thank you again.
Thanks, Josh. I am delighted to see FindFixer grow and launch in New South Wales. It was always in the back of all of our minds as we were building the tool back in 2015 that wouldn't it be great if we could roll out something like this nationally, and to see it making its way up the eastern seaboard is just fantastic.
We're now going to hear from Nicole, who played a really big role in this project. Could you start by introducing yourself?
I'm Nicole Stack, and I'm a paralegal in the Work and Development Order Service at Legal Aid. And we deal mainly with fines and, of course, getting people onto work and development orders, and with the sponsors who help the clients.
Oh, wonderful. And I understand you've also done some of the work in terms of bringing FindFixer from Victoria to New South Wales so that people in Victoria and New South Wales can both now go to FindFixer to get help with their fines. Is that right?
That is correct, yes. So I was involved in the initial stage, which was with you, Josh, and Kirsty from the WDO team and Legal Aid and the CLE team. And that basically went to ground after a little while, but then FindFixer made its resurrection in FindFixer 2.0, and it was only by chance really that I got involved the second time. The solicitor that I work with, Linda Mines, was part of the FindFixer team, and she just happened to say to me one day, oh, we've got this meeting, do you want to jump in since you had something to do with it in the first place? And so I said, oh yeah. And then I became very involved.
And what did that involve?
So I started that initial meeting I was in on. They just put the pathways for FindFixer New South Wales together, which they, of course, based heavily on how the Victorian FindFixer pathways worked. So having had some past history in dealing with fines in the actual government side of things with Revenue New South Wales, I had a pretty good understanding of what the ebb and flow of fines and how the system works and the process of beginning to end. So, yeah, I was able to pick up within that pathway things within New South Wales that were totally different to how things work in Victoria.
And were there a lot of differences?
There were quite a few differences. The Victorian system, so Vic Fines in Victoria is very much just a debt collection centre. So whilst they receive all the reviews and people that want to appeal their fines, that sort of information through Vic Fines, a lot of the actual review of appeals go back to the court system or they go back to the issuing authorities. So, yeah, their impact on how they deal with it was quite different to how Revenue New South Wales deal with fines. Revenue New South Wales are very involved in the system from woe to go. So after a fine's been issued, the issuing authorities basically don't have anything to do with it again unless it ends up in court. So Revenue New South Wales make all the review decisions. They set up the payment plans. They have work and development orders in place, which a lot of the other states, and with Victoria, their WDP program was still only in very early throes back then. And, yeah, they basically are the ones that are the go-to in dealing with clients. So their system of how a review would be done was very different to Victoria. The option to do a WDO is very different to Victoria. Revenue New South Wales also deals a lot with government debt as well, which includes civil type debt like ambulance fees under the COVID public health orders. They also now deal with the quarantine fees that the government putting out for the mandatory quarantine. So, yeah, they have another separate collection system for that. So we had to provide details on those. They also do some review for other government type fines like New South Wales government voting fines and jury duty fines. So they were other areas that we had to look at to be included.
Is there I understand there's a huge range of fines. I'm just trying to understand how would you try and capture all of the different fines and all of the different pathways?
Yep.
I'm just trying to get a grasp on the kind of the size of the task that you were working on.
Yep, so it was a challenge. So there's around 17,000 different fines in New South Wales. So when we first looked at that, of course you can't give a client advice on every single fine.
Yeah.
So it was basically drilling down what the main types of fines are. So we kind of pooled them into traffic fines, public transport, parking, toll fines, and court fines. And then, as I said before, we had like our separate government agency fines, which was the jury duty, ambulance, voting, and also the other one I forgot to include was victims' restitution orders, because they'd only recently come across from victim services. And then we looked at who the issuing authorities were for the majority of fines. So then that came down to them being likely to be either council or police for parking traffic offences. So we kind of included those type of fines in there. Plus we put council in for separate fines because they also look after things like dog fines and fines that come under that kind of jurisdiction. So, yeah, so we kind of pulled them into who was likely to issue a fine and the great broader aspect of what the fine was likely to be about.
Yeah, okay. And is there a situation where somebody would have a particular type of fine and it's not covered by a fine fixer?
Not that I can think of. In Victoria, that's where it may differ. But as I said, we're pretty lucky in New South Wales that Revenue New South Wales basically captures the majority of fines that are government issued. So, yeah, I suppose the ones that would likely flag as not being available for a solution under Fine Fixer would be private parking fines. But we did work into our scope of work to provide information on where people should go with those types of fines. Same with toll fines, well, not the actual fines, but the toll fee. So tollways look after non-paid tolls. Then what they will do is issue a fine if a person doesn't deal with those unpaid tolls, but those unpaid tolls still sit there, of course. So people still need to deal with the tollway. So we also gave some information on how people can go about dealing with their tolls as well.
Have you tried to explain what Fine Fixer is to somebody who's never heard of it? And is there a particular wording that you use to try to break down exactly what this is?
So to me, Fine Fixer is, I suppose, a collection of information on fines from different resources. So, of course, Revenue New South Wales was our main resource. But we know when you go onto websites to look for information that often there'll be different pathways that'll lead you and you get confused and you don't know where you should go. So what we've tried to do was narrow down the main aspects of when you've got a type of fine, what you should do. So, for example, a traffic fine, if you weren't driving, how you should nominate a driver, and more information on consequences if you don't nominate a driver or if you incorrectly nominate a driver. Same with the ability to maybe if you want to court elect a matter. So, yeah, to me it's just putting a lot of information into one place and providing direct links to where people can go to make that next step of dealing with their fine. So, yeah, just a portal that's full of easy to read and links to access to be able to deal and hopefully resolve a fine issue.
Yeah, wonderful. And how would you compare Fine Fixer to other ways that people can get information online about what to do if they have a fine?
As I said, I think Fine Fixer is a central point. So even if it's just that initial starting point for people to find out information about fines, I think it's very good in making people aware that in some instances they shouldn't just deal with your fine, that there's other options. There's options, well, it's always good too around demerit points where people can lose their licence to seek legal advice, because the advice that other people give you may not always be correct. So there may be options for you to not lose your licence, or, you know, to go for things like good behaviour periods if you've got loss of demerit points, or appeal a licence suspension if you're on your P plates. You can go to court and appeal that sort of suspension. So it's just providing people with a range of options in one spot. So they don't have to go searching, say, on Revenue New South Wales website, on the RMS website, on councils' websites. That's something that's, you know, very complex. Then, yeah, the spot would be to refer them to a legal service in their community. If they're in financial hardship, there's places there to provide them with referrals to financial counsellors. Yeah, so it's just offering a range of services in one point with links that are direct and easy to follow.
Do you have any stories about the impact that the work and development order service that you work in?
Yep.
Do you have any examples of where your service has a really big impact on somebody's life?
Yeah, so we often get people that have extremely large fines and are extremely vulnerable. Fines are always one of those things that when you've got a lot going on in your life, you really don't want to deal with them. They're kind of the end of the line, especially if you've got financial hardship and you've got to pay electricity and eat and, you know, rent, mortgage, whatever else, and you can't deal with the fines. What people don't realise is that can then lead to further hardship. Revenue New South Wales can put further restrictions that stop you from driving, which may stop you going to work, which may impact your income and your circumstances more. So work and development orders were brought in to allow people that can't pay their fines to undertake an activity to pay their fines by non-monetary means. And so we have lots of wonderful sponsors out there. I have seen number of people that have large debts. They may start off with, I suppose they had one person that was in drug and alcohol treatment, so they'd gone through their treatment program and they paid off a number of their fines. Their sponsor organisation, which is, a lot of them are community and government organisations, so they're aware of other possibilities for clients, and this client was, you know, probably come to the end of their drug and alcohol treatment but still had a large amount of fines. And so they refer them back to do a TAFE course, and they reported back that after they completed the TAFE course that the change in this person was phenomenal, just because of their previous life. They hadn't been very social, but being amongst people, undertaking an education program, drug and alcohol treatment had helped them initially, but it allowed them to move on and look at getting a job, whilst they'd also cleared their fine debt in full.
Amazing.
So, yeah. That makes a big difference, yep.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole.
That's okay, no problems. Thanks for having me, Josh.
We will now finish by hearing from Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Kirsty Harrison. I'm the Acting Manager of the Work and Development Order Service here at Legal Aid New South Wales.
Thanks, Kirsty. Could we start off, would you be able to explain what the Fine Fixer tool is?
Sure. So Fine Fixer is what we call a guided pathway tool. So that's where a user can proceed through a number of questions about a legal issue, and at the conclusion of that pathway, they're given or provided with a legal option that deals with their matter, and that legal option is tailored to their particular circumstances. What's great about the Fine Fixer tool is that the information is given quickly and at a point in time where legal intervention is likely to have the greatest impact.
And do you see this kind of tool, can it be a substitute for legal advice, or?
Not in all circumstances, and certainly with this particular tool, there are, as a user may proceed through the different pathway options, they might at the end of it be given the information that they actually need to obtain legal advice about their particular issue. So it's certainly not in all circumstances intended to replace legal advice, but rather for more simple matters provide options for resolution.
Mm-hmm. And what's the easiest way for people listening to find it?
It's on the Law Access website. So it's a category. The category of tool is called a guided pathway, and on the Law Access website, on their homepage, they have a link that takes you to all of their guided pathways. Amazing.
And when did it launch?
The Fine Fixer launched in September 2020, which I guess the timing was serendipitous given that we had still closed our outreach advice clinics. We were only providing phone advice at that time still, so having another option for people that had fines matters to obtain legal information about it quickly was really useful.
And who is it for? Like, who's the intended audience?
The tool is targeted towards higher capability clients, so people that have the capacity to resolve their legal matter or their fine matter themselves without needing advice or further assistance to do that.
Yeah, great. And what has the response been? Have you been getting a lot of users?
A lot, actually, a lot more than we originally thought. So between September 2020 and April 2021, we have had almost 13,000 users, and some of the more popular topics have been around how to nominate another driver and what options people that have more than one fine have for managing those fines or that fines debt.
And have you had any kind of anecdotal feedback around how people are finding using the Fine Fixer tool?
Yes, so the feedback that we've had is that it's really simple and easy to use. The actual interface is really user-friendly and the language is clear. There's no kind of legal jargon, and that was done obviously quite intentionally, but that the language is accessible and just generally that the tool's quite easy to use and navigate.
Yeah, great. Are you worried that because of this tool there might be people who need to speak to a lawyer, but because of the tool they might get turned off and not resolve their fine issue? I think you talked a little bit earlier around sometimes people might get referred to a lawyer at the end of the pathway.
Yeah, certainly. So the Fine Fixer is not intended to replace legal advice when particular issues arise during a user's journey through the pathway, it may be the case that they're presented with the information that they need to obtain legal advice to deal with their particular issue. What it does is provides legal information and options that are tailored to a person's particular circumstances. And we certainly hope that those people that are told that they do need legal advice, that they are given the options of how to take the next step to get in contact with a lawyer and get that advice.
And I guess you've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what would you say to any community workers who are listening that are worried that some vulnerable clients may not have the literacy or the ability to access this tool?
That's a really great question. So as I said earlier, the tool is targeted to higher capability clients, so we would always encourage vulnerable people to obtain legal advice through the usual channels, through Law Access, Community Legal Centre and so forth. But having said that, Find Fixer is designed to allow a user to proceed through the entire pathway without providing any personal information at all. So advocates and community workers they also have the option to assist their clients to work through the tool for more simple matters, or they can refer them to Law Access for legal advice specific to their particular issue.
Can I ask you about the 13,000 or so users that we've had? Do we have any idea about how they're finding Find Fixer?
We do. We have, interestingly, the majority of those, a very large majority of those users have been referred to the Find Fixer from the Revenue New South Wales website. So they've gone on to they've been given a fine or a penalty notice. That fine has the Revenue New South Wales details on it. They've proceeded to that website and been referred off to Find Fixer from the Revenue New South Wales website.
You've been working with fines for a while now. Are you able to tell us what keeps you excited and what makes you passionate to work in this area of law?
I guess every day is different. Certainly in the fines law space, there's, for example, over 17,000 different types of penalty notice offences in New South Wales. So the range and breadth of work is very different. I guess more recently, Revenue New South Wales have a really interesting program of work as a result of the Fairer Fines reforms, where they're doing some community consultation with local communities to develop community action plans to address fines debt in, areas of really high fines debt. And tackle some of those problems, kind of giving community ownership of some of the debt, but also some priorities in how they're going to address that debt. So that's at the moment a really exciting program of work to be involved in.
Yeah, amazing. So the community's actually come up with a way to try to reduce fine debt in their own communities.
Absolutely. And Revenue have provided them with details on the debt. So what types of debt, what the fines are, some of those kind of high, in regions where there are really high fines debt, what that debt actually is for. So they will provide community with a breakdown and, give them some ownership and agency over how to resolve some of those issues, because in many cases they're systemic issues and that affect quite a significant number of people in a particular community. So, that's an exciting program, and working with Revenue in that space is, it's really interesting. I guess too, from a work and development order perspective, which is probably a larger piece of our work, is supporting sponsors and organisations in the community who are existing WDO sponsors or want to become WDO sponsors to be able to support their clients to clear their fines debt. Many of our sponsors, as you know, Josh, use the WDO scheme as a mechanism to engage with their clients. It can be a bit of a carrot to keep clients engaged with particular services or programs. It incentivises some of their work in a lot of ways. So it's a great program.
For any community workers that are listening that may not be aware of what the Work and Development Order Scheme is, would you be able to explain that to us?
Sure. So the Work and Development Order Scheme is a restorative justice program that allows eligible people to complete activities, treatment, or volunteer work to clear their fines debt. So some of the activities could include volunteer work, medical or mental health treatment in accordance with a medical practitioner's treatment plan, educational activities, vocational life skills courses, for example, financial counselling or other counselling, drug and alcohol treatment, and for participants who are under 25, they're also able to complete a mentoring program.
And who is eligible?
So there are eligibility criteria that apply for participation in the WDO scheme. So a person is eligible if they have a mental illness, an intellectual disability, or a cognitive impairment, if they're homeless, if they have a serious addiction to drugs or alcohol or other volatile substances, or if they're in acute economic hardship.
Okay. Do you think the Fine Fixer tool interacts well with the Work and Development Order Scheme?
Absolutely. So we built into the Fine Fixer tool some of those criteria about eligibility for participation in the scheme, and those questions are asked as part of that pathway. So a user, if they are eligible and they answer those questions in the affirmative, then they will be told at the end when they kind of get to their options to resolve their fines, they will be told you may be eligible for a work and development order and then what next steps they need to take.
I might ask just one final question. Are you able to talk about the impact that fines can have on an individual?
Sure. So fines can affect people in a number of ways. Of course, there's the obvious things around the financial difficulties and challenges around having fines and fines debt, even just having a time to pay, for example, arrangement with revenue where you're making smaller contributions to your fine just to pay it off over a period of time can have a really significant impact on your financial situation on, as that payment plan plays out. But also having unpaid fines debt, if it's not managed, can have significant impacts on people where enforcement action has been taken by Revenue New South Wales. So when I talk about enforcement action, I mean things like imposing driver restrictions or license or business restrictions on a person. So that's where their license is suspended because of fine default. And what can happen, and we see it quite often in some of our casework, is where some people might not be aware that they have a fine that's outstanding because they've moved or they haven't checked their mail or they haven't been given the notice. Revenue have then enforced that debt and suspended their license, and they're still driving, and obviously there can be issues with secondary offending as a result. So, I guess a key message is always to have your fines managed and under control, because if you're on a payment plan or you're on a work and development order, then that will stop that enforcement action from Revenue New South Wales.
If somebody has a few different fines, is that sometimes an indicator that they could have other legal issues as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what we find when you have a fine or you have a penalty notice, you have a document, you have a due date, and you have something that can, I guess, prompt you to get some advice about. And when we meet with clients or we speak with clients and we discuss the fine, and we do a law checkup with them when they do come to us for advice, and we often find that there are other things. What we know anecdotally and even through the law survey done by the Law and Justice Foundation is that I think it's only around 16% of people that have a legal issue actually go to a lawyer to get advice about that issue. And so sometimes fines can be the reason that someone gets advice, but sometimes not the most pressing legal issue. So when we do that law checkup with them and some of those other issues come to the surface, we can support them to deal with all of their legal issues.
Yeah, amazing. Are there different community organisations that might use the WDO scheme to incentivise their services?
Yes, absolutely. I can give you an example of a health matter actually that comes to my mind. So recently a local health district had identified that their area had the lowest rate of pap smears in the country. So they launched a campaign to encourage women to attend for a pap smear. And as an incentive, that particular health service offered women the opportunity to reduce their fines through participating in a work and development order in exchange for doing this preventative health check. And out of the 16 women who participated in the campaign, 9 of them completed a work and development order and cleared their fines, because under the work and development order guidelines, a person can do a WDO for treatment that is prescribed or recommended by a health practitioner, or that's undertaken in accordance with a health practitioner's treatment plan. And you can clear up to $1,000 per month for full compliance with a medical treatment program. One of the women who participated in this particular campaign, she had not had a pap smear for quite some time. She attended the health service originally because it was an opportunity also for her to clear her fines. When she went back for her results, it was detected that she had early stages cancer, and she received treatment at the local hospital and her prognosis was good. We've been advised since that she's doing quite well and she's had a baby since. So, yeah, we heard that she's become a bit of a health advocate.
Amazing.
Among her community, yeah.
And just to finish off, are there any key messages that you'd like community workers to remember about Fine Fixer or fines?
Just to not ignore a fine and asking their clients the question, do you have fines? Because the thing about fines is that generally it's a pretty simple matter to resolve, and there are a number of different ways that we can resolve fines for clients. There is a whole hardship program of work that Revenue do, and there are a number of things that we can do, either a WDO, a write-off application, even just supporting a client and putting them on a reasonable time to pay arrangement with Revenue. But yeah, the key message, don't ignore a fine and ask your clients if they have one.
Thank you so much. And any last final message around Fine Fixer itself that you'd like community workers to remember?
Just that the tool, it only takes a few minutes. It will present a number of options for your clients, and you can support your clients to go through that tool. It's completely anonymous. You don't need to enter any personal details of your clients, and it's something that you can do really quickly to get some options to support your clients in resolving their fines matter.
Just because I'm curious, do you know, would lawyers ever use this tool as well as something that they could go through with a client?
Definitely. And I've heard from other colleagues that practice in other areas of law that they've used it, and other CLCs. I mean, I myself have used other similar tools. You know, Josh, you and I we love that motor vehicle problem solver tool. So even, I think absolutely yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Kirsty, and thank you, listeners. We hope you found this episode interesting and useful. Please check the show notes for a link to Fine Fixer and some information about fines and work and development orders and legal health checks. See you next time.
Thanks so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode and found it useful, please share it with your organisation, your colleagues and communities. If you would like to access any of the information spoken about in the episode, please see the links in the show notes below. Until next time, thanks from all of us here at the CLE branch at Legal Aid New South Wales.